Welcome. My name is Jeanette Sanger, and I am chair of the lecture and exhibition committee here at our wonderful New York Society Library, the oldest cultural institute in the city, founded in 1754, used by our first president, George Washington. Took a book out, but he never returned it. And it's such a pleasure to welcome these two lions of journalism, Carl Bernstein and Lance Morrow. Carl honors Lance in his book and acknowledges him on page 1. In Chasing History, we see a whole new side of Carl, the beginning of his storied literary career at age 16, when things did not look promising, with his risk of not graduating from high school and being a truant to boot. He says it in this book. I'm not making it up. So.
It's worse than that.
Carl must have been everybody's favorite bad boy. With his dancing on the Milt Grant show, similar to American Bandstand, which I used to love, and his knowledge of all my favorite rock and roll singers, the Big Bopper and Bill Haley and the Comets. He even was a drag racer. It is fascinating to read about the early days of journalism in this charming account of his adventures, starting as a copy boy at age 16. By 19, he was a full reporter. During this time, he was also going to school, at least some of the time. His drive, perseverance, and dogged pursuit of the truth are truly inspirational. Carl seems to be a kind of zealot, showing up in some way at all the major events of the early 60s, the Kennedy era, the civil rights movement, plus fires and murders. I was so jealous reading this because I was imprisoned in a girls' boarding school and Carl was out there doing all these really exciting things. He captures the rhythm of a big newspaper and its multiple editors and the men and women who made it happen. We are very lucky to have Lance Morrow tonight in conversation with Carl. Lance is an American essayist who regularly writes for the Wall Street Journal. He is a Henry Grunwald Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. For many years, he was an essayist at Time magazine. He is the winner of the National Magazine Award and the author of 8 books. And now, let us welcome Carl and Lance.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeanette. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to see Carl again. Carl and I have known each other for nearly 60 years. I can't believe it. We were sitting up in the green room a minute ago, and Carl took out his iPhone and showed me footage of himself dancing on the Bill Grant show.
Oh.
And
You had a slide.
I wish
you know, it's absolutely, it's the most kinetic thing. Amazing.
I wish I want to see it.
No, it's well, I was, as I said, Carl and I have known each other for many, many years, and I can't quite get used to. I sometimes find it difficult to remember that he's like famous. And, we were supposed to have lunch a couple of years ago at a club in Midtown where there are a number of famous members. I said to the guy in the lobby, I got there early, and I said to the guy in the lobby, Carl Bernstein's going to come and join me for lunch, and would you tell him I'm upstairs? And the guy said, "The Carl Bernstein?" So this book is about Carl Bernstein before he became the Carl Bernstein. It's really a delightful book, and it brings it all back. Carl was paying much closer attention, obviously, than I was at the time, and saw a lot of things that I didn't see. But it's a remarkable book, and it's funny, but it's got a lot of fun, very funny stories in it. But it's got a dimension of history in it, and those 5 years between 1960 and 1965 were really dense with historical events. Starting with when he comes in at the Kennedy Nixon presidential race, he's at Montgomery Blair High School. He goes to a Kennedy rally, which is a wonderful description of Kennedy giving this absolutely incoherent speech. No sense whatever, but everybody, yeah, wonderful. And then he goes through the Camelot and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the early civil rights movement, in which Carl was very heavily involved. It's fascinating. At a very early age, Carl was involved. I mean, Stokely Carmichael and all kinds of the early characters in the civil rights movement. Carl was very much involved in that. And then it goes up through the assassination, very poignant chapters about that, and then the beginning of Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society, and the beginning of Vietnam up to 65. So it's a wonderful period, and I won't take too much more time, but the thing that struck me about Carl and I became pretty good friends at the time, and what struck me, I should say at the beginning, was that Carl was different in that he had a vocation. I think this was one of the things that had an influence later in Watergate. This was a kid with a lot of freckles and so on, but he had a vocation to this work that most of us didn't have. A lot of reporters were cynical and so on about newspaper work, but Carl was a very avid, serious student of how it's done. He kept card files and clipping files and all sorts of. They're really a precocious and thoroughgoing and intense interest, and he wasn't for a moment cynical about the work. He was sort of reverent about the work, which was very interesting to see. If I were, there are several books in this. Russell Baker wrote a wonderful book called Growing Up. H.L. Mencken in the late 30s wrote a book about his early career called Newspaper Days, and this book is right up there with those classics, I think. If I were a college professor, which thank God I'm not, I would give a lecture and I would say this might belong to the category of the picaresque. The picaresque means basically the adventures of a young rascal. And we have the rascal right here. So.
I should interrupt to say that there are some stories that are not told in the book that were about two rascals, which is him and me together.
And
we left them
we agreed a long time ago.
There were a couple stories we would never put in the book.
So to begin, if you go into anybody who's been into the newsroom of a major newspaper in the 21st century knows that when you walk in, it looks like a scene from 2001, The Space Odyssey. There are these glowing screens. There's the little click of the computer keyboards, and they're very subdued, soft voices. So I wanted to ask Carl if he would begin by telling us what he encountered when he first saw the newsroom of the Washington Evening Star.
Well, it also goes to how I got hired at the Washington Evening
Right,
Star,
yeah.
and what Jeanette was saying about where I was in life at the time. And also, I want to contrast it with the newsroom of All the President's Men as well, which was much fancier than what the Star newsroom was like.
Yeah.
And I was 16 years old, and I had kind of 1 foot, a little bit of 1 foot in the classroom, 1 foot in the pool hall, and another foot in the juvenile court system of Montgomery County, Maryland. And my father, also was the opinion of all 3 experts at those institutions that I was going nowhere. And my father had a sense, I'd taken a 10th grade journalism course and I could write a little bit. And he had a sense that maybe I could get hired at a newspaper, the lowest entry rung, which was a copy boy. And he had been a source. The Star was the conservative paper in town, as opposed to the Washington Post editorial policies. And he favored the Star because it had covered a strike by his union with great fairness, as opposed to the Post, which had actually in the McCarthy era red-baited his union. And so as a source, there was a government columnist. He called him up, and the government columnist said, let me take him in to see the production editor as a member of the owning family of the Star and see if he can get hired as a copy boy. And I went for this interview, and there was no way this guy was going to hire me, because he kept looking at me and said, boy, I thought you were going to be a senior in high school, because I was about 5'3" and freckled. And I just bought this cream-colored suit at no label Louis downtown. And I said, no, I really am. I'm going to be a senior in high school. And he said, come back after you graduated from high school. And I said, oh, geez, I'm not going to get hired here. And he then said, he escorted me to a door. I'd come in a different door, and he escorted me a door that went into the newsroom. And never, it's the most stunning moment in my life, really. Never had I seen such glorious, purposeful commotion. And 50 people, great noise and typewriters and bells going off from the wire machines, and everybody running around like it was the most urgent errands in the nation that they were doing. And he took me down this center aisle with the reporter's desk, these gunmetal desks on each side of this aisle, and people yelling copy. And then a copy boy came with a dolly full of newspapers from just off the presses, and he handed me one. It was still warm. And in that moment, I said to myself, I want to be a newspaper man. And I mean, that was it. But he wasn't going to hire me. So I came back a couple days later with an essay I had written for school, and he took it, and then it didn't do any good. And I came back again and sat outside his office, and he said, boy, can you type? Well, I had taken typing with the girls in 10th grade because I was sick of shop classes. And building these little wooden trays with fish handles on them. You put toothpicks in it. And he said, boy, can you type? And I said, yeah, in fact, I can type, pretty good. And he said, go take a typing test and go see the nurse. You imagine the newspaper in those days that had a nurse, kind of paternalism that actually marked this paper that we had worked at. And I took this typing test, and he called me. He said, come back to the paper. I said, boy, you didn't tell me you could type like that. And I could type 90 words a minute, actually. And he hired me as a copy boy at $29 a week. And that was the start of it.
I should mention that there was very rapidly, Carl goes on to become what they call a dictation typist, which it's an afternoon paper, so you don't have time to go back to the office and write. You have to dictate from the field, from a phone booth, stick a dime in the phone booth. And so you had to be a dictation typist, which is what I was at the time Carl and I met, and then he became a dictation. And when they gave you the typing test, the one word that was in it that you absolutely damn well knew was going to be in it was Khrushchev. And the reason was that there were 3 H's that shouldn't be there. And so and actually it's very shrewd, because your presence of mind under deadline pressure was, can he manage 3 H's?
The reason I passed the test to get onto the dictation bank was because my roommate, I was 17 or 18, and I was living with 4 reporters who were in Arlington, Virginia, who were about, mid-20s, early 20s. And one of them said to me, just remember how to spell Khrushchev. So that's the other thing I owe everything to, is that tip.
Well, the initiation for a punk reporter was the cops. You'd go to police headquarters. Carl, do you want to undertake to describe Ted Crown?
Well, there were 3 reporters who covered police for the Washington Star, the Washington Post, and the Washington Daily News, which was the tabloid. And in fact, Al Lewis from the Post has the byline on the first Watergate story. And but the Star, there was a guy named Ted Crown, J. Theodore Crown. And one of the hallmarks of these 3 reporters is none of them could write a paragraph if you paid them. In fact, most of the time there were no typewriters down there. And Morrow came down there one day with a portable typewriter, and they started to call him Hemingway. And they would call in their notes to a rewrite man back at the paper. But and they had vicious fights among themselves, great prejudices toward people in general of various religions, racial groups, including Crown, who would boast on. And this book, let me say something about this book, just parenthetically, that, my 5 years at the Star bracket the Civil War by 100 years exactly afterwards. And so the Civil War was like a pall over our lives. I grew up, I'm 2nd generation native of Washington, and it was a Jim Crow town. I went to segregated public schools in the capital of the United States. Very few people realized that Washington, D.C. Had segregated schools till I was in the 6th grade, and under Brown versus Board of Education, finally schools were integrated. When I was in the swimming pools were drained by a local recreation department, so black and white kids couldn't swim together. Downtown restaurants, black people could not eat in the restaurants. They had to stand at the lunch counters. And with my parents as a small kid, I'd been in, we call them sit downs, and not sit-ins, because my parents were involved in civil rights very, very early. So that's part of the composition of this, or the template in which we all were working and living at the time. And then I forgot the question altogether.
Ted Crown.
Ted Crown liked to boast. Ted Crown liked to boast, actually, that his family in Maryland had owned 4 slaves. And there was no question about him expressing his prejudices. And yet, if there were a story involving a Negro, which was the word that was always used at the time, he would bend over backwards to say, this guy is getting railroaded because of his race. And he would spell it out to the rewrite man so that somehow it would get in the paper. But Crown had this amazing way of talking that only one rewrite man could really handle him, a guy named Herman Shaden. And Herman was called the magician because he could make the words jump like trout. But he was really a magician because he could make sense out of what Ted Crown was saying. So Crown would talk like this. He'd say, last night, 3 white men in a woman of the mulatto persuasion were arrested for hitting about the head a man who had asked about a certain proposition that he wanted to make to the woman involved. He talked like this all the time. Nobody could understand a damn word he said. But that's literally how he talked. And
If you,
let me tell you one other thing about this press room where these 3 guys worked. And it was bare except for 3 big desks with the pockmarks of the cops had put in their initials, the way people would write, do on a tree. But the distinguishing factor was this big map of the District of Columbia behind the Daily News Reporter. And Johnny Birch was his name. Oh, I'm sorry, this daily news reporter at police headquarters, and there was this big map behind him in the District of Columbia. And Birch would rock back and forth in his chair, and he kind of had a greasy haircut, so about every 6 months, the part of the map had to be, and the sign had to be replaced from about Mount Pleasant Street to Florida Avenue, because he would wear a hole in the map of the District of Columbia. Does that give you some idea of what this place? Let me say also, Warren Hogue is with us tonight, and Hogue also covered police headquarters and knows of this strange enterprise down there.
If you think of the great movie that was made of the front page, the movie's called His Girl Friday, and if you think of the press room in that at headquarters in that movie, the press room that we're talking about was Warren. I don't know. Can you do an imitation of Ted Crown?
I can't, but I sent Cole a note after the book saying your imitation is perfect. I didn't hear Ted Crown, but I couldn't possibly do it.
I can do imitating of Ted Crown. If you get a dozen people from this town in the same room, they'll talk about it.
One time he said, it's in a story, he said to rewrite man, he was hoisted on his own leotard.
There was a guy from the homicide squad decided that I was this jerk in horn rimmed glasses, and I'd show up with an addition of commentary and encounter under my arm. And the guys in the homicide squad started calling me Hemingway, and they said, and so I think it was you who told me the solution is buy a fifth of bourbon on a Saturday night, go to the homicide squad, walk in when they're all just sitting around, and just pour drinks for everybody, and get a little loaded with the homicide squad, and it worked. Anyway, Walter Gold, would you explain, Walter?
I was, including an extension of what you just said about drinking with guys in the homicide squad. Walter Gold, he was about 8 years older than I, but he had grown up under similar circumstances and attended the rival high school of my own. And he was the night police reporter. And he practiced what was the assistant city editor called fire journalism. And when you get there at night, Walter would have a big stack of magazines devoted to firefighting on his desk. And he had this Pontiac Bonneville that he had tricked out for getting into fires, and there were axes in the trunk, and he wore a running coat so he could run into the burning building with his hat on and his rubber coat. And I say, as I say in the book, I went to a lot of fires, but I never dressed for the occasion. I had no desire to go into the burning building either. But Walter loved it. And he also, there was a guy who worked at WMAL-TV, which was owned by the Star, a guy named Larry Krebs, who dressed in black and white and walked and looked like a penguin. And they worked in tandem. And I learned a lot. In fact, some of what you see in Watergate, I learned from these two guys. And what Lance was just saying about drinking bourbon at the homicide squad, I would go with Walter. Let's say there was a murder, and wanted to know as much as he could very quickly. Walter and Krebs carried with them a thermos full of coffee, donuts, rolls of dimes and quarters, which I also learned very quickly to carry with me so you could get to a payphone. But they treated these cops with the greatest respect.
Yeah.
And they treated the cops as real human beings, not as sources for a story that you shoved a notebook or a microphone in their faces and ran out the door because you thought you had a story, which incidentally was prevalent, not just now, but also, I think, in those days, too many reporters. But they had a genuine feeling for these people. And I think it was a lesson that I learned, and particularly was helpful in Watergate, because in Watergate you see how Bob and myself, we learned to look at our sources as people who were going through an experience and to identify with their struggles as people, including some of them who were criminal.
This is one of the most interesting things about this book, is you can see Carl as a kid, but he's absorbing, he's learning. Carl's an incredibly fast learner.
Except in school.
Except in school. But you can see, one of the interesting things about this book is you can see Carl learning. You can watch him learning and absorbing a subtle lessons about how you talk to people and how you, a certain respect and so on, including cops and the rest of it. But it's very interesting to watch this. And when Watergate came along, and then I was reading All the President's Men and all of that, I thought that, that just didn't happen. That was a result of an education that began in that period.
You see something about the book and what it is and what it isn't. Basically, it's this kid who at age 16 gets the best seat in the country. Yeah. In this moment of national history, when all these things are happening, and especially the Civil Rights Revolution, and especially the Kennedy presidency, the beginning of the Vietnam War, and so this kid gets the best seat there really is in the country, and it is a vocation. Yeah. It's not a profession in the classic sense. And I've been there. Lance talked about Kennedy coming to my high school after I'd been there about 2 months. But the first thing that happened about 10 days after I'd come to the paper, and this will give you the idea of this kid and also there's a direct line. The book is not the old man looking back. It's written from the point of view and the voice, pretty much, of the kid at the time.
Yeah.
And
which is why you can see him learning.
Yeah. And so very early in the book, and when I've only been there about 10 days, and the chief copy boy, who was the boss of all of us, his copy boys, said, Bernstein, get in a cab, go out to Burning Tree, which is a country club out in suburban Maryland, and there's a photographer there from our photography department taking pictures of Ike on the golf course, President Eisenhower, and go to the photographer and bring back his rolls of film. So I go, and I had this identification card that we all got at the Star, and I had it around my neck, and I got to Burning Tree, and I showed the identification card to the chief caddy, and he took me out to this putting green. And 10 feet away from me was the President of the United States sinking putts. And by then, I fancied myself, I'd like to be a reporter, and I had a notebook that I carried with me. I could see that Ike had brown spots on his hand. So I wrote in there about the brown spots. And meanwhile, the photographer is kind of looking at me saying, hey, you're here to get, you're here to get these damn pictures. And there's only one Secret Service man while I was sinking putts there. And then I got the pictures and took them back to the office. This is the first time I'd seen a president of the United States. Well, my mother said that she had taken me to watch FDR's funeral when I was about a year old.
The Star it was an unusual paper. I mean, many thought it was the best afternoon paper in the country, and I think that's probably right. And there were wonderful. The reason was that there were people like Mary McGrory. I don't know if her name rings a bell with any of you, but Mary was wonderful, and she sort of adopted Carl and became his mentor, and he became her baggage handler.
That's the right word.
But Hayes Johnson was there, and David Broder, and others who were just terrific.
Back to those first days when I went to work there, and the head copy boy, in fact, it was my first day at the paper, the head copy boy was giving me a tour. And he pointed to 3 people and their desks in the room, and he talked about them almost a unit. And he said, they're all won the Pulitzer Prize. All 3 were women. Mary Lou Werner had won the previous year, and she was really, I get emotional about her even now. She was really a great mentor to me, and she covered massive resistance to desegregation in Virginia, where she had grown up in suburban Virginia. And her high school was one of those schools that had been shut down by the governor, by Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia, to keep integration from coming to Virginia. The other was Miriam Ottenberg, who won the Pulitzer that year, or the year before, for investigative reporting. And so I would talk to her a good bit, and for 2 reasons. One, she was a great reporter, and also her family owned Ottenberg's Bakery, which since the Civil War had given, provided seeded rye bread for everybody in Washington, D.C., especially who were Jewish. And the third Pulitzer winner was Mary McGrory, and who had an imperious side to her. And very early on, and also all the desks in the newsroom, they were like fire hazards with just piles of newspapers and clippings and congressional directories. And and most people put their cigarettes out. Everybody smoked. Most people put their cigarettes out on the floor, because if they tried to put it in the ashtray, the whole damn place would have gone up in flames.
Occasionally you'd get a small
Yeah, there would be.
waste
Yeah,
basket.
there would be. Yes, there were conflagrations occasionally. Her desk was pristine, and except for a rose in a vase, and
And a pack of Marlboros.
and a pack of Marlboros. But she wrote, and the other thing this head copy boy said to me that first day, he said, she writes the best prose of anybody at this newspaper, and stopped on the word prose. And she also had engaged everybody to serve her, especially the copy boys. But she was famous on the campaign trail for getting the most senior reporters in the country to carry her bags, her portable typewriter.
You'd see
And very
Walter
early-
Lippmann walking.
That's right. And very early on, she figured out that I was good at getting her at National Airport to her plane. And so I would go she would get me to go with her to get her to the plane and get her on the plane, and I would be carrying her bags. The other thing she did, though, is she really worshipped at the Kennedy altar, but she also wrote about the Kennedy family with such beauty and grace.
Yeah.
And then she was never married, but she loved children, and she had kind of adopted these kids at the St. Anne's infant home, because in those days, Catholic kids who were born to women out of wedlock, to use the term at the time, went to this orphanage. But she would give parties for these kids, and every Wednesday, she would take them to Hickory Hill, which was the home of Bobby and Ethel Kennedy. And we would go on Wednesdays to take these kids swimming in the Kennedy backyard. And give you some idea, though, of what's going on at the time.
What was that great scene where you saw Bobby by the telephone?
Oh, it was terrible. It was, the first time I had gone there, I watched Bobby. There was this little brown telephone with about 5 buttons by the pool. And Bobby would go over there and he'd be on the phone with the White House, talking to his brother, president. And then after the assassination, I think the first time I went there, he went over to that phone and you could see his misery. And yet, McGrory got him to do this thing, and he played the game, and he'd throw the children in a pool, and he'd take them out. It was heartbreaking.
Yeah. There was the Star was a really interesting paper with a lot of flaws and so on, and yet with many virtues. There was also a quality that you talk about in the book of a certain camaraderie among us and so on. You want to talk about that, and also about every newspaper has a saloon, and ours was called Arrogance. Maybe you could-
Well, first of all, there are a lot of heavy drinkers, serious drinkers.
I'm shocked.
At the newspaper. And so they had this saloon down in the redevelopment area of Southwest Washington. It was kind of like an island unto itself while the place was being cleared out all around it. And every day, 15, 20 reporters at lunch would head for Harrigan's. And most of them drank these big bird bath martinis for lunch. I was 16, and the first time I went there, and I looked at them, and I don't know, I ordered a bird bath martini. I love the taste of it. They would drink two. And, but unimpaired, I went back to the office and did my work. And then afterwards, they would go back to this place after the last edition of the paper at 5 o'clock. They would go back and drink pitchers of beer on the theory that they were waiting out the rush hour, which went to about 11:30, 12 o'clock at night. But the other thing was, that there was a kind of camaraderie and an esprit of the people at the Star, and particularly it had nothing to do with age. They were all, I was 16, 17. I was part of the family. I mean, it was much more my family than my own in most regards. And these people saw something in me maybe I didn't see in myself. And but the camaraderie of the place, and part of the camaraderie was based on beating the hell out of the Washington Post day after day after day. And we did. We were a better newspaper. The Post didn't get to be a great newspaper until Ben Bradley got there. And one of the mistakes that the Star made, the owners of the Star, the families that owned the Star, is in 1954, when the Star had dominated the newspaper market since the Lincoln administration, and they were great supporters of Lincoln, that it dominated the advertising and the news in the capital of the United States. And then there was a paper called the Times Herald, which published 10 editions a day around the clock, and had a huge circulation. And it was put up for sale in 1954, and the Post bought it. And it got, among other things, it got 4 more pages of comics that went into the Post, and that started to help the Post. But there was no morning competition anymore. And the Star's owners, who were in many ways by that time becoming arteriosclerotic, I guess, some of them were still very sharp, in fact, but some of them were not, and including the ones who decided not to bid on the Times Herald. So the Washington Post became the Washington Post and Times Herald equal size type to the Washington Post on the masthead. And then year by year and month by month, Times Herald gets smaller and smaller, and it became the Washington Post again. But by that time, it had more advertising than Star. It was starting to cover the news better. And the great mistake was not buying the Times Herald. And of course, afternoon papers, the suburbs were becoming much more essential to getting readers. You couldn't get an afternoon paper out to the suburbs in the trucks fast enough. So they're all, and beginning of television news too, from going 15-minute broadcast to half an hour. And so all of this figured in the Star starting to lose its great history and its dominance.
Would you talk for a second about the contrast between the Star and the, you were talking about the sort of the spirit of
Well, first of all, there was this camaraderie at the Star, and people at the Post, they'd say, hey, you people are having a lot more fun than we are over here. And when I went to the Washington Post and went into the newsroom after I got hired at the Post, I thought I was going to work for a goddamn insurance company. And there was none of this spirit that we had. And of course, part of it was being a paper that came out in the day, 5 editions a day, and this constant motion and noise. And at the Post, the first edition came out at 11 o'clock at night. So it was a kind of quiet. And part of the noise at the Star was people hollering like in Ben Hecht and like in His Girl Friday and all these great movies. People yelling, copy, like that. And then the copy boys, 10 or 12 would be running all over the place. And then there came a time at the Washington Post, I see Richard Cohen in the back, who was at the Post with me at the time. And it was in the middle of Watergate. And I was in the office working late on a Watergate story. By then, Watergate was the biggest story probably in the country. And Cohen was working, and I was too, on a story that Vice President Agnew was about to go. The grand jury was investigating him for all this corruption. And in the middle of this, there was a guy on a copy desk named Jack Lemmon, who I'd worked with at Star, and he'd come over to the Post. And in this tumult that was going on in the newsroom that night, he yelled, as he often did at the Star, "Copy!" I jumped up. I was the only one in the room, but instinctively, I was still that kid in the middle of Watergate. Oh, copy!
Carl, could you connect what you learned in those years to what happened later?
Sure. Look, everything I know about reporting, pretty much, I learned at the Star. I learned from Bob Woodward some, and he learned from me. But even though the story of this book ends in 65 and is written in the voice of this kid, you can see, and I didn't even realize it when I was writing it, and then a lot of people started to point it out later, including in some of the reviews, it's almost like a prelude to All the President's Men. Because the techniques of reporting that I learned there, the two-source rule that we used in Watergate, you have to have two sources before you could put an important story in the paper. That came from the Star. The whole idea of going out of the office at night to see people in their homes, away from pressure, away from intimidation. Common sense is a lot of what we learned at the Star, and there's too much rarefied stuff at some newspapers, I think, instead of common sense. But an awful lot of what you see in All the President's Men was really stuff that, and again, being a good listener. That's really key to reporting. A lot of reporters are not good listeners. You know, this whole idea of manufactured controversy, sensationalism. You know, you're there to. Woodward and I use the phrase, "What is good reporting?" Woodward and I use the phrase, "the best obtainable version of the truth." That came from something at the Star that we called the complexity of the truth. The idea that context, you could string disparate facts together. It has nothing to do with the truth. The context is all important. And there's a line in the book also, and I learned this covering civil rights early on. And I say in the book, I learned that the truth is not neutral. And there's a myth that I think has saddled the journalism profession for too long, and that is of, quote, objectivity. The most important thing that a reporter and editor does, first of all, is to make a decision about what is news. That's the most subjective of acts. And so if you decide that the story, the real story, is civil rights and what is happening to people on those picket lines or freedom riders going down to the South, and there's nothing neutral about those stories that you're doing. There's nothing neutral about covering a lynching. But I've been there, I don't know what, a year, 2 years, I guess, and just had been made a reporter. And I was told to go to the National Airport and meet Rita Schwerner at the airport. She had come to Washington to see President Johnson because at the time, her husband, Mickey Schwerner, and Cheney and Goodman were the names of their Mickey Schwerner's colleagues who were missing in Mississippi. She was about 22 years old, not that much older than I. And I spent the day with her. And then It was 2 weeks later that her husband and Cheney and Goodman were found shot in the head and buried under a levee in Mississippi. There's nothing neutral about that story. And so I say in the book, I learned that, and I learned it particularly from great Southerners who were reporters for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Star. So that whole idea, again, there's an extension that picks up with All the President's Men, and you can see it when you read the book, and it's kind of a prelude in its way. There's a kind of resonance that I didn't realize when I was writing it, but when I went back to read it and edit it, I said, oh, that's kind of interesting.
One of the fascinating things about the book to me is that the city of Washington itself is a major character in the book. And Washington, where I grew up, like Carl, it's the capital of the superpower. There's the White House and the Capitol and the huge government and everything. It's also a very, very small town. And Carl gets that wonderfully and it's a relationship between the public and the private. And you were just sort of talking about it in a way, about how you talk to people and how it's all very alive and complicated.
It's also one of the reasons that the Star was a better paper, because the family that owned it was crafty enough to hire local people.
Yeah.
As the primary reporters, and probably a third of the staff,
Right.
born and raised in Washington,
Right.
like we were.
So,
And the city editor, who there are three characters, I guess, in the book that are most prominent, and that's the kid, this incredible city editor named Sid Epstein, who was the most elegant person I've ever met in my life. He dressed in these sherbet colors, Oxford cloth shirts that he had made at Lewis and Thomas Salt's downtown, and perfect rep tie, wingtip shoes. But he didn't strut like a major peacock. There was an almost reserve about him. And at the same time, he projected both this elegance, and he was the commander in the newsroom. There was no mistaking that he was really the commander. But one of the things about the idea of small town Washington we grew up in, when I was 8 and 9 years old, I would carry grocery bags from the A&P and get tipped a quarter on Albemarle Street. Well, these two people did not. I didn't carry their bags because they had staff to do it, Lady Bird Johnson and Pat Nixon. We would see them in a grocery store. We'd see Lyndon Johnson having a sandwich at Wag Shaw's. I'd be riding my bike on the C&O Canal, and Justice Douglas would be on his walk. My next door neighbor, who became a great source, you see it, and he was like the mayor of Washington, D.C., was Senator Alan Bible of Nevada. And he was my next door neighbor. And I was used to banging on the kitchen door when I was 15, 14, and going to see him and his kids who I went to school with, and coming in for dinner in there. And then I went to work at the Star. I go knock on the door, and he became a source. So, and especially as head of the District of Columbia Committee. So there's this, and in fact, there came a point, it's not in the book, I tried to write it, and I say something about Lance in this book. I mean, this book would not exist without Lance. That when I first conceived the idea, I called Lance, and he helped me put together an outline, 50 pages, I think it was, of what this thing would be. And throughout the process, I shoved pages to Lance. So he's very much a part of this process. There's no way this book would have succeeded without Lance, to whom the book is dedicated, along with the people that we worked with.
Thank you, Tom.
That
was as much fun as I've ever had.
So, but this idea of, also my grandfather was a tailor. From the time he got off the boat from Russia, he had a tiny little tailor shop. But he did the cleaning, took in the dresses and pants, and even for the Kennedy inauguration, he took in the grandees. He took in their cleaning, and so I would see him in the shop all the time. So there also came a time that Chief Justice Warren, he liked to walk to the Supreme Court. And so he would stop his limousine at Florida Avenue, and he would walk down to the University Club because he liked to swim there. And then from the University Club, he would walk to the Supreme Court. So one day I saw him and I said, "Can I walk with you?" He said, "Yeah." And I did that a couple times and talked to him, and he was very circumspect. But you could do this, and so
Yeah, but that's the kind of thing you did too. I mean,
the line. I'm looking at my wife because she gets angry at me when I interview everybody. And but no, this was a city. And my mother was born in Washington, and so it was a small town. And at the same time, there are these gleaming monuments, and yet we're going to No Label Louis to get our clothes. We're also going to these fabulous embassy parties, and because it was free food. And these were major players. Well, how did we get into the embassy parties? First of all, we all bought tuxedos at No Label Louis, except for one person who already owned a tuxedo, who was Hogue. And Hogue, even then, had a kind of elegance that the rest of us scruffs did not have. And
What we added to the uniform was a big colored sash across the chest.
It looked like a diplomat, yeah. Sash across his chest. But we were kind of like penguins behind him. And we would follow Hogue into the embassy, and he would say, "Hello, Mr. Ambassador. Oh, did I see that the dean of the ambassadors is here. Hello, Mr. Dean." And we would just follow him in the joint. And one other story about Hogue. When he first came to the paper, he got this idea for a feature story about swimming pools on the roofs of apartment buildings where all the girls hung out. And he worked on this thing for months, all the months of the summer. And so I would go with Hogue, and then we would go up and we spend a day at the swimming pool. And it was terrific.
Jeanette, should we ask for questions or?
Yeah.
Is it?
That would be great.
Is that okay with you?
Sure, no, it'd be fun. Just shout it.
There was one very funny story you told in the book about the carbon paper and your first day there.
Oh my God.
That's a great story.
Well, what happened
Yeah,
was,
got to be the short form.
I'll give you the short version. I had on this cream-colored suit that I bought at No Label Louis, just for the purpose of my interview that I've described. And one of the jobs of copy boys was to collect all of the carbon paper in the newsroom every morning, and reporters typed their stories in what were called books. It had 3 or 4 pieces of this double-sided carbon paper, which is damn near as thick as a steak. And if you just touching it, your hands became empurpled. And so the assistant head copy boy said to me on my second day at the paper, he said, "Bernstein, it's 11 o'clock. I look up at the clock, see, it's 11 o'clock. It's time to watch the carbon paper." I said, "What?" My father owned a laundromat by this time because the McCarthy period had rendered him no longer a professional, and he owned a neighborhood laundromat. So I never heard of watching carbon paper. He said, "Oh yeah, you gotta watch the carbon paper. If we don't get it watched to, somebody's gonna kick our ass here." And he said, "Follow me." So he showed me how to pick up a piece of carbon paper and gave me the basket, of course. He did not go all around the room.
Mind you, Carl is in this cream color.
Right. And so I'm holding this damn thing, and it's getting higher and higher with carbon paper like this. And he said, "Get in the men's room and watch this carbon paper." And so I kind of feeling that there's something going on here. And I kind of get out the newsroom and to the washroom, and I go like that with this damn thing of carbon paper. And then I get in there, and I have a feeling that people are kind of watching me do this. So I better watch the carbon paper. So I take a sheaf of it like this and I put it in the sink and I turn it on. It was one of those newfangled faucets that had like an aerator. It all sprayed back on me. I looked like a leopard in a rainstorm. And with all these purple dots all over me. And I started to put a second batch of laundry under there. And then I saw that somebody was combing his hair next to me in the mirror. And I saw that it was the deputy editor of the paper and one of the owners, Newbold Noyes Jr. And he looked at me and said, "Son, what are you doing?" "Oh, Mr. Noyes, very proud of myself for recognizing him." I said, "I'm just washing the carpet paper. It's 11 o'clock. And he looked at me and he got angry. I was thinking, you're angry at the wrong party. It's not me. It's the guy out there that sent me in here to do this. And then he started to giggle. He said, "Just tell him if this ever happens again, heads are going to roll." And then that was my second day at the paper. But I held on to the suit because my grandfather took in cleaning. He knew that in Silver Spring, Maryland, where I lived, was the National Institute of Dry Cleaning, the biggest employer in Silver Spring, Maryland, and I could take the suit there and they would figure out how to clean the spots off. And they did.
Are there any questions?
Yes.
I just have an observation. I used to work at the New York Times. I spent my whole career there, crossing paths with
Tell us your name.
Leslie Wayne, W-A-Y-N-E. And I was in the business section. But when I was a beginning reporter in the early 1970s, I worked at the News and Observer in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I remember you coming down to our newsroom. You were working then at the Washington Post, and how impressed I was to see somebody from the Washington Post coming down. And you sat at the desk, and I remember that you were very intense, worked hard.
And probably told the same stories.
But I basically had a view of the back of your head, but it was very impressive.
That was in the front of my head.
Yeah. If you remember Claude Sitton?
Oh, yeah, Sitton,
Yeah, he
sure.
was the editor of that.
Yeah.
So,
Somebody's writing a book on Sitton, and I can't remember who it is, actually. Sarah.
We have a question from the live stream from Charles Houghton or Houghton, which may be relevant. It says, "Carl, you were very candid about your bad habits at the start. What were Lance's bad habits? And who was the fastest typist?"
Lance's bad habits.
I thought we had made an agreement.
Right, we tended toward the same proclivities. How's that?
The worst.
I'm going to leave it at that. Some of it had to do with after-hours clubs. There were after-hours clubs that had
Research reporting.
research reporting. We had great fun together. That was really it. What was the other question, Sarah?
And who was the fastest typist?
The fastest typist was actually, I was the second fastest typist. The fastest was a woman named Martha Angle, who also grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland.
I got to tell you, I clocked in one time at 120.
Oh, well, then you're faster than I am.
Okay, well, no, but it was a freak.
No, I could do 90, but Martha Angle, the carriage of her typewriter just went like that. And there was one reporter there who was an absolutely great reporter named Bill Hines, probably the best science reporter in the country. And he also covered the space race, which is another thing that was happening when this kid gets this great seat in the country, and covered some of the parades for the astronauts. And Hines dictated so fast that nobody could keep up with him, especially when he was down at Cape Canaveral. And so he started he would only dictate to Martha, and if she wasn't there, I would take it, but I couldn't keep up with it. He was so fast dictating and wouldn't stop. And I think there's a sentence in the book is he didn't suffer fools gladly. What's the rest of it? He didn't suffer fools gladly.
He didn't suffer intelligent people
much.
much.
That's the line in the book. And there came a day, though, when the astronauts parade can't remember if it was for John Glenn for the first orbital flight, but I think it was the first suborbital flight. And there was a parade down the Canyon of Heroes here downtown, and he came up here for it. And in the middle of the parade, there was a terrible airplane crash. At either LaGuardia or Newark, I can't remember which, 100 and something people, I think, were killed.
I forgot.
And Hines, who was just to give you an idea of what this guy could do, he was in the middle of covering this parade. And some of the fire trucks in the parade were diverted to go to the airline crash. He jumped onto the back of a hook and ladder and got the story from these firemen, and was way ahead, from their radios and everything. And then he started dictating this account of this terrible airplane crash. But only Martha could take his dictation so well that from the first space shot, she got a $25 bond that the city editor gave her for being able to keep up with Hines.
I got about 15 paragraphs behind Bill one time. I was taking some story from the Cape or something. It was a nightmare.
Any other questions? That's it? Yes.
I too am a former journalist. I love your stories because of the characters. And I'd be interested on your reflections on how that has changed, because I don't think newsrooms have the kinds of characters that we had when we were starting out.
Well, let me say two things. Could everybody hear the question? The question was saying she too worked in a newsroom. And I've described the kind of characters and wondering if those kind of characters still are in newsrooms. I think it's a different profession. I think one of the awful things that happened in journalism, and it started when I'd been at the Star, I don't know, maybe in my 5th year, I was the only person who had been put on the staff without a college degree. And I had to leave the paper eventually because they still insisted that I graduate college, and I had already flunked out and thrown out by then. But the characters, I think, don't exist in great numbers the way, one, because there's not that kind of camaraderie, but I think we make a mistake to be too nostalgic about what happened back then and what goes on now. Because back to this idea of the best obtainable version of the truth. The internet is obviously, and incidentally, the internet is often said to have been the death of journalism or such thing. I don't believe it. That before the internet, chains like the net, others came in to towns all over America, bought up one of 2 papers in those towns, stripped those papers of their reporters, and turned those papers into advertising vehicles, started a joint operating agreement with the second paper in that town, closed down the separate, and up until the end of the 20th century, and the internet is by then with us, newspapers were averaging 19% return. They were making money. Yes, the internet then came, but what's happened with the internet, which is a shame, is that too many young reporters look at it as a reporting vehicle instead of the great tool that it is and ought to be. You look at Watergate, and all the time Woodward and I would spend, looking up, trying to find addresses, phone numbers, using these cumbersome city directories, trying to find people. If we could do it, we would have saved ourselves months if we had had that. But we still would have gone out of the office. And what increasingly has happened in newsrooms are reporters don't go out of the office, and they see the internet and the telephone. And also the telephone is a great instrument to do reporting on some of the time. And when I was early on, I got very good at using it because sometimes I was a little reluctant because I was so short and so young. I didn't want to see some people, and I was like, I could act older on the telephone. But today, there's a real problem about relying on those resources instead of doing these basic things that we learn. And at the same time, there's another myth, I think, that is too nostalgic, that there's not great reporting going on, that there's not great investigative reporting, especially going on. I mean, I would say this about the Trump presidency, for instance. I think it's the greatest reporting of the White House I've ever seen in my lifetime. 9, 10, 11 news organizations, day after day, telling us what Donald Trump is doing, who he really is. The picture we have of Trump is not from people inside the White House. It's from the reporting, including Bob's in his books, including stuff that we've been able to do at CNN, but a real picture of Trump because of this great reporting. There are a good number of investigative reporting nonprofit organizations that have done great stories like the Panama Papers. So I think it's a mistake, but yes, we have lost great news organizations. We've lost community and local papers, which is a terrible thing because the local paper in most towns and cities in this country was a kind of fabric that held a civic compact together. You know, they would cover the library, they would cover the school board meetings, they would cover the sports section would be full of the high school and junior high school basketball results and who the great players are. We really missed that in this country, I think, today. And it's had something to do with shredding the civic compact that I think existed.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.